As we travel along with Jesus on this journey of his, we have now reached the 16th chapter of the Gospel of Luke. And you'll recall that last week, at the beginning of that chapter, we said that it was a chapter which is primarily concerned with wealth and with our relationship to money. This is the chapter which says you cannot serve both God and mammon. This is the chapter which had that parable about the shrewd manager and his use of money. It's a period in the life of the gospel when Jesus has been using, for the most part, parables to make his points. A few weeks ago, I quoted to you from Emily Dickinson, who says that you should tell the truth, but tell it slant. That is, don't pound people over the head with what you think the truth is, but tell it in a way that it sneaks into them, that it sneaks underneath their skin, and that they have to live with it in their hearts. That's what poetry is very often, and it definitely is what parables are as well. They're not intended to pound you over the head with some truth. They are intended to insinuate their way into your lives. They are intended to be things that you can live with and chew on for a while. And that's been the story of these parables that we've heard in the last few weeks. Today's parable is a little bit different. Between last week and this week, Luke has reported that there are lots of Pharisees there listening to him, and Pharisees, he says, are lovers of wealth. It's not clear whether Pharisees universally were lovers of wealth. They were certainly the power structure of the day, but that's Luke's characterization of them. And he puts it right before we hear this parable. This parable is different because it's more like a folk tale than a parable. You remember the ones we've heard recently have had to do with a shepherd who loses sheep, a woman who loses a coin, this shady manager last week, and the people who work in his vineyard, all of whom are characters that you can really and truly relate to if you are in that crowd listening to Jesus. Today's story is a little different because it's more like a fable, folk tale. It's a story about a rich man, and all we're told about him is that he's rich. He lives in a sumptuous way. He's got sumptuous garments to wear. He lives the good life. He has tons of food and parties. We can sort of imagine that. And at his gate, that is to say, he lives, of course, in a kind of gated community. And just outside the gate is this poor man named Lazarus, who has nothing and just longs to have the scraps from the table, and has even the dogs come and lick his wounds. And they both die. And the poor man, named Lazarus, is swept away by angels to the bosom of Abraham, as they say, or as the translation now is tidied up to say, beside Abraham. And the rich man dies and he goes down to Hades. And you've heard the story. He calls out to Abraham, and he says, send Lazarus with some water to relieve me. And Abraham says, no, I'm not going to do that. And besides, there's this great gulf between you and us, and you can't get over here, and we can't get over there. It's a permanent gulf between us. And then the man says, well, at least send him to the house of my brothers and warn them. And Abraham says, well, if they can't listen to Moses and the prophets and understand what they're supposed to do than even someone rising from the dead to tell them isn't going to make any difference in their life. So it's an odd parable. It's not one where we can put ourselves directly into either role, as we can in so many of his parables. It's the portrait of the rich man is not a portrait of a bad man, of an evil man. It's just a portrait of a rich man who does not see. He doesn't notice Lazarus, and he doesn't certainly do anything on Lazarus's behalf. It's simply a description of the way in which riches have blinded him to his brothers and sisters in the world. He can't get outside his rich little bubble that he lives in order to touch the humanity of another person. When we hear this parable, we're not intended to be the rich man, and we're certainly not intended to be the poor man. But maybe we are intended to be the brothers, the ones who are alive, who still are leading their lives, who have the ability to know what Moses and the prophets have said. And we have the advantage of even knowing what the one who returned from the dead has said. This is a message for those early Christians and for us late Christians about how we are to regard wealth and its use and its place